Mic's not on.
There we go. All right. Good morning and welcome to the December meeting of the Cobb County Board of Education. If you would, please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. This brings us to public comments. Mr. Doyle, do we have any commenters?
No commenters this morning,
All right.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you, sir. So now we'll move to the approval of the minutes. If there is no objection, the minutes stand approved. Next, we have the approval of the agenda. If there is no objection, our agenda is approved. And now we're ready to hear board business, and we'll start with Mr. Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Facilities and Technology Citizens Oversight Committee met this week, and they supported all of the agenda items that are before us today. They also adopted a resolution that they wanted to see that the committee meet more than 4 times per year. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for the report, Mr. Sweeney. All right. And next, Mr. Scamhorn, we'll go to you. Policy BBC.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Wish everybody a good morning. And as in front of you, there is the version of the BBC policy that has been discussed, well, it was brought up during our retreat and discussed last during our work session, and now is before us for approval this morning. So, Mr. Chair, I'd like to make a motion that the board adopt the changes in policy BBC.
Yes. Potential action. All right. All right. We have a motion. Do we have a second? Mr. Wheeler, seconds. All right. Motion and a second. Is there any discussion? Mr. Sweeney.
Yes. During the last meeting, I made some comments relative to the policy, and the premise behind this was, I believe, that the committee now should only meet 4 times per year, and that it would supposedly free up some resources and those types of things. I've asked the superintendent if the superintendent is prepared to do things on a quarterly basis and have all SPLOST items done on a quarterly basis that would allow the purview of the committee to take a look at SPLOST items, and to which he said mostly. Is that correct?
Well, let me clarify now. You talking about presenting to the board or presenting to the F&T? To the board, no. No, we would not change the process of bringing agenda items to the board.
Okay. And that's I think some of the issue here. So, with regard to this, what I've done is I've actually supplied each board member with a policy revision, and candidly, there was a lot of material in this policy that really needed to be cleaned up. And I know that each of you are just now seeing this. But some of the things that are in here, for example, is that my proposal is that the F&T committee shall convene each time that the board receives a SPLOST project recommendation. So if the superintendent is only presenting things 4 times per year, the F&T committee would only meet 4 times per year. If the if the district administration is presenting 6 times per year with SPLOST items, then the F&T committee would meet 6 times per year. So it'll still allows the F&T committee to review the material that has been presented to the Board of Education before the board's consideration. Now, one of the things during the F&T committee meeting that we shared, and Mr. Adams was there, Mr. Nick Parker was there, is really kind of talking about the actual charge of this committee. Now, the committee, and at the meetings that I've been president, I know that other board members have been president, tends to get off the rails a little bit. And I mean that in the most respectful way. And what do I mean? Well, for example, they will start to talk about project prioritization. All right? The board doesn't establish priorities. The administration establishes priorities, and we determine whether or not we're going to support those priorities. And yet, the F&T committee starts to weigh in on conversations and discussions. The charge of the committee was actually very, very simple when this was established. Were the items that are in the SPLOST notebook being recommended by the administration, yes or no? That's the very simple charge. It's not a budget committee. It's not a prioritization committee. There was a lot of superfluous language that was actually within the prior BBC policy before these recommendations that I've changed. So I actually crafted a few different revisions. And Mr. Scammahorn, to your point, is if the administration only makes recommendations 4 times a year, that's all the committee's going to get together for. And these are unsplossed recommendations. But the F&T committee actually said, you know, listen, we're okay with that, but what we would like to do is at least get together after, and you know, preceding each time that the board is considering any splossed item. So I know there's a lot of changes in here. There's no rush to get this done. There's no pressing deadline. So what I would encourage each of you to do, and I would recommend that we actually table this from an action item, and that we have everybody have an opportunity to take a look at this material. We can have a deeper discussion perhaps at our next board meeting. I'll make a motion that we table this item.
Well, okay, all right. Your motion to table.
Second.
So we have a motion, second to table. Is there any discussion on tabling the motion? Mr. Scammahorn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would be opposed to tabling this for 2 very simple reasons. One, it's a very straightforward, simple change. The policy didn't need to be rewritten. It's just simply to make it more efficient. That's the first thing. Second thing is we've had 3.5, 4 weeks to coordinate and to discuss this. To my knowledge, and any other board member may correct me, that hasn't happened. So I would be opposed to tabling this. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Scammahorn. Any other discussion? Okay, we ready to take a vote on tabling the motion. So all those who support the motion to table, please raise your hand. That's 2. Okay, all those opposed, raise your hand to table. Okay, so now that motion is defeated, and we will now move back to the original motion. Is there any further discussion? Okay. All right, Mr. Sweeney.
I just want it to be known, if this is adopted as it is, I feel it reduces the transparency of the SPLOST process.
Mr. Scammahorn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I respect Mr. Sweeney's opinion, but there's no changes in anything. There's nothing. In fact, we may have more transparency because it'll allow the members to get out more between meetings, and the same information, unless corrected by Mr. Adams or Mr. Ragsdale, would be furnished to the F&T committee. So there's no loss at all. In fact, it may increase transparency. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Cameron. Mr. Sweeney.
This will be my final comment. I believe that the revision as it stands, one of the things that's stripped out of here is the ability for the committee to have a call meeting. And that was a provision that was in the policy before. And so, again, as far as reductions in this, I mean, you're basically saying that the committee can no longer have a called meeting, that you're limiting the meetings to 4 times per year. So everybody needs to understand that as they're considering the adoption of this. Thank you.
Any questions, any comments? Mr. Wheeler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That was my understanding, too, that there was the option, what I guess you'd call it D section, was if there was an emergency meeting that they needed to have, they could do that. But that's not in this one either. But the policy hasn't changed. That was the quarterly, that was my understanding, plus an emergency.
Okay, any other discussion? Are we ready for the vote? Mr. Banks?
To adopt the Mr. Scamhorn's changes to this policy will have far-reaching effect in the future on the future splashes. So this is not a very good move to make as far as going to the quarterly meetings, because there's limited amount of oversight. Some of the projects that are going to be presented by the time they are presented and by the time the F&T committee meets, it's too late to make any recommendations or ask any questions. It's already over. I think for future splash, the more transparency we have to the public is most beneficial to this board and to the F&T committee and to the possibility of future splashes. So I'd be very careful on what we're doing here. This really should have been tabled so we could have a chance to review both of them. The board decided not to do it, so I don't know what the reasoning is, but be very careful on changing policies that's been in effect since the beginning of splash process. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Sweeney?
Yeah, and something I brought up at the prior meeting, and the reason for a complete revision of this policy is there are things in here that are listed today that are really not the purview of the F&T committee, nor were they ever intended to be the purview of the F&T committee. For example, there's a line in here saying that the committee shall review all facilities and technology expenditures, and it doesn't delineate that they are only SPLOST facilities and technology expenditures. You know, the committee is not charged, nor was it ever charged, with reviewing 100% of the facility expenditures that are made by the district in our maintenance and operations budget. But this policy would intimate that that is actually one of its charges, and that's not a correction that was made in this policy. Thank you.
Okay, anything else? Are we ready to vote? All right, so Mr. Wheeler.
Can Mr. Scamahorn's policy, can that be amended, the meetings, and add that? Emergency meetings could be called if needed by...
Mr. Scamahorn, what is your thoughts?
Well, I would prefer it not to be amended, but it's straightforward. The policy's clear. It's been minimal changes, and I'd go with it like it is.
Okay, so did you want to make an amendment, Mr. Wheeler?
I'd like to add that. If there was an if a needed something came that they had to have it, that would be available.
Mr. Chair.
But the policy, the main thing, the main body is to me, is appropriate. It's pretty clear what their charges are.
To help Mr. Wheeler, how many emergency meetings have they had in the past?
I don't know if they've had any.
None. So
I'm just saying that.
Again, I would be, excuse me, I would consider that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you, Mr. Scamahorn. So do you want to continue with your motion, Mr. Wheeler?
I'd like to add that if that's appropriate.
So I'm asking you if you want to make a motion.
I'm not sure
To
where
amend.
who would call that meeting, if that would be the board chairman or the superintendent. If they felt that needed to be done. This is a board committee.
Anybody have any thoughts?
Whatever his motion is, he can make it.
Yeah.
Mr. Doyle, who would
Yeah,
that?
Mr. Wheeler, you
who would
can-
have, who would have the authority to call that meeting?
Who do you want to include in your motion, I guess is the question.
I would include that with the preface that if the emergency meeting, if called by the board chairman. If the board chairman felt that they needed to meet, that they'd have that priority. Or option. How you word that, I'm not sure.
All right, so,
Emergency meetings could be called
It
by
would-
the board chair if needed.
It would be up to the board member to word the motion. You know, and this is not for a working out the language. The language is here to be voted on. So that's where I would go, is there.
I think, Mr. Wheeler, I think you're wondering if a sentence could be added that just says that the school board chair, I take it that's what you mean,
Could
as in
convene
the
this
chairman
committee.
of the Board of Education, not the chairman of the F&T committee, right?
Correct.
There could just be a sentence added as the second sentence of 7A that says the school board chair may also call a special meeting when? At any time, or?
If needed, or if any.
If needed, that's a good phrase. If needed, so I have that in writing.
Not the
if you
F&T,
wanna-
not the F&T committee, but the chair of the board. It's a board committee. This policy's fine.
Okay.
But if they needed to do something, or the board needed them to review something, that would give them that option as well.
so your motion is to add that language to
Mr.
7A,
Scanlon's.
to Mr. Scam.
Yes,
All right,
correct.
so now you've made your motion. Do we have a second to the motion? All right, Mr. Banks is second. Is there any more discussion now on this motion?
Yes.
All right, Mr. Sweeney.
And if you'll allow me, may I ask Mr. Wheeler a question?
Certainly.
Would it be your intent that the board as a whole directs the chair, or are you suggesting that it's the chair, just by the chair's own authority, an individual could convene the committee?
I could answer that because the way we have it worded is that the school board chair makes a decision.
Yeah. Okay. And with respect, I mean, that could end up being a very political issue relative to one individual being able to call a meeting. Okay, so that you need to think about that in the way that's phrased, and from a governance standpoint, depending on whomever may be sitting in this chair, you're giving that one person the ability to call a meeting. Currently, the language that's in here is saying that the committee, called meetings may be scheduled if approved by a majority of the committee's membership. And just a hypothetical, let's say, for example, that there was something that raised concern with regard to, actions by the board or whatever. This gives the committee an opportunity to say, hey, you're raising a valid issue, you have the authority to raise a valid issue, but we're interested in this. Would you then want that committee to have the purview or the opportunity to review any action that's being presented before the board? Let's say, for example, that you have we have a standard in the district that says we're building 3,000 seat gymnasiums. You're aware of that. And then all of a sudden, we decide that we're building a 10,000 seat facility, but it was never called for within the referendum. So the board chair, maybe favors a 10,000 seat facility. You're going to have the board chair go ahead and avoid calling a meeting because he favors that position. So again, just providing a hypothetical here. Thank you.
Mr. Scamahorn.
If I may take the privilege of asking Mr. Wheeler, based on the ambiguity in uncertainty if he might withdraw his amendment. Thank you.
To Mr. Wheeler.
Kind of interesting. Can I answer Mr. Sweeney's question? I would hope that the board chair, it would not be a political thing if it were to be, to avoid that, if that's what needed to be done, then the board chair may call the meeting per a vote of the board. If the board felt it was a needed meeting. I mean, that gives everybody on the board a say. If the board feels it's important, then you'd call them out. If the board thinks it's not important, then they do their job as stated.
Okay, any other comments? Okay, so the motion stands, the second stands. Any other discussion? So the motion here is to, Ms. Thayer.
Rather than the chair, would you say have a board vote?
Majority of the board. Rewrite that.
Well, now we would have to modify.
Well, we can go, this is the one time you can keep going up the motions ladder, and you could, if this is what you're talking about, Mr. Wheeler, the motion has this sentence as a new addition. The school board chair may also call a special meeting if needed. But you could replace the word school board chair with whatever you're proposing, a majority of the board. But you can also do that by consent. If everyone consents to have Mr. Wheeler's motion amended as such, you can do it that way. And if there is an objection, then I would encourage the board to vote, if that's the way you want to do it.
So, Mr. Doyle, you're saying that you're suggesting the wording might be with board consent?
Majority of the board.
All right, majority.
Say with the consent of the board.
All right,
You don't have
okay.
to vote on another motion.
Right, okay. Mr. Wheeler, how do you feel about that?
I'm good with that. It's a board committee. We're the one making the policy.
Yes, yes.
They're not.
Yes. All right.
That's why I see it.
Mr. Scamahorn.
One last comment. We're conflating the issue because if it's a so-called emergency meeting, then you'd have to canvass the board, which is negating the issue of a non-existent emergency meeting. They've never had an emergency meeting, and I would simply urge the board to vote to oppose this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, Mr. Scamahorn. Mr. Wheeler.
I hope I'm clear. This is a board committee. This is appointed by the board. The board should have authority on who makes the policies for it. My thing is that if the board felt they need to have a meeting, we should have the authority to convene them. This is stated, says that they meet 4 times a year. I guess we could do that anyway without, is that possible? If you had the 4 meetings, we could still convene them at board pleasure? Then you wouldn't, if that's possible, then you don't need to add that. I'm just thinking of the board. If we as a board felt that was important, then we would convene them. If that's not needed, if that's not needed, then I don't mean to get in the weeds.
Well, that's okay. Are we ready to vote on the amendment to the motion? The changed amendment. Mr. Doyle,
It's the amendment to the amendment.
The amendment square. Yeah. Mr. Banks, you need to weigh in. Do you still second, Mr.
You can get the second from anybody. It's the amendment to the amendment.
Two amendments.
Turn your microphone on.
Yeah, yes, Mr. Chair, you need to, the point of order here would be to ask if anyone seconds the amendment to the amendment.
Okay, so we are going, all right.
All
So,
right, I'll second it.
all right, Mr. Banks will second the amendment to the amendment.
And
as
what is that?
stated.
And what is
Okay.
the amendment?
So the amendment is to replace the words school board chair with the majority of the board.
Okay.
Okay, so Mr. Banks is good with that? All right, now, we ready to vote on the amendment to the amendment? Mr. Sweeney?
Procedurally, I would be interested in understanding how that would work. I mean, for example, you're suggesting that it's an emergency. All right, maybe that's why they convene. So is there going to be a called meeting by the board chair of the Board of Education, of which we're going to have a quorum to raise our hands and say this, or is this something that you anticipate would occur during a work session or a voting session? All right. Part of the rationale behind allowing a committee to convene, upon itself, is to stop that from happening. So the policy as it is today, before any modifications, allows a majority of the F&T committee to have a meeting for their conducting business. So before we go down this path, procedurally, you got to figure out, okay, like under what circumstance would the board, gather together to say we're going to go ahead and have a vote to have the committee have a meeting. So procedurally, you really have to think about how that actually works.
Mr. Wheeler?
Question, Mr. Attorney, Mr. Superintendent. That motion may not even be needed. Question about board committees. If the board wants a committee to convene, does the board have the authority to convene them? Or are they convening themselves on their own? If the board has the authority to convene them, then we don't need this amendment. We can go with Mr. Scamhorn's as it is. I'm in favor of that, if that works. All I'm trying to say is that the board ought to have the authority over a committee. The committee doesn't have the authority over the board.
The board has the authority to establish committees, and the way that the board does that is through policy BBC, which is the one we're tweaking at this point. So ultimately, yes, I would say the board does have the authority over the committees, but the way to do it is exactly how we're discussing doing it today.
What I'm saying is Mr. Scamahorn's motion, it potentially could limit the board from if they needed to convene that group.
All right, let's, Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me ask, I guess, the whole board, the hypothetical. If the superintendent brings, say, 5 SPLOSH projects in January, the F&T committee would not meet until April. That means that the board would have presented, or the superintendent would have presented projects to be voted on in January. So what kind of an effect or oversight would the F&T committee have in that situation?
Okay, Mr. Scamahorn.
Oh, I thought the board member was asking a question that was a rhetorical question? Okay.
He was asking anybody on the board.
Okay. Well, a couple quick things. Is Mr. Wheeler trying to withdraw his motion? And if not, I'd like to call the question, please, sir.
Okay. We ready for the question? Call for the question on, this is still on the amendment to the amendment.
Yes, sir. He made the motion and it's been seconded, so
Yes.
we're
Yeah,
stuck
we got it.
with that.
All right. This is the amendment to the amendment. Any other discussion? We've had a call for the question. Okay. The amendment was about the all right, the amendment was about the board chair. Am I correct, Mr. Doyle?
Yes, so
Or
you
the
can vote
committee.
on the,
All right.
on Mr. Wheeler's motion to amend the amendment to replace the word school board chair with majority of the board.
Okay, all right. All right, Mr. Wheeler.
I hate to keep going around and around. My question, like I say, Mr. Superintendent or Mr. Doyle, does the board have the authority to convene this committee at their will? If they do, we can, with that motion needs, I would withdraw that and use, this is fine. This is fine as is.
Right.
I'm saying to not limit the board.
The parliamentarian has already answered that explicitly. Yes, the board does, and he can correct me if he didn't.
If that be the case, then I will withdraw that motion.
You can't withdraw the motion. It's been seconded. It's ready for a vote.
Yeah, all right. So,
Unless there's no objection or a vote.
Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If what we're doing is negating the organization of the F&T committee because it has no real function other than what the board decides if it's going to meet. What happens if it don't have a quorum? Because if the board says, okay, F&T committee, you will meet on such and such a date, well, that may not happen because it's not. I mean, it may happen, but it may not be a quorum there to make any decisions. So, again, we come back to we're neutering the oversight of the F&T committee, which is responsible for input to the board and from the community itself. So, I say again, we're on dangerous ground here when we start changing the oversight and transparency.
Okay, thank you, Mr.
Mr. Chair, the question's been called.
Yes, we have had a call for the question. All right, so this is the amendment to the amendment. Everybody clear where we are at this point? Okay. All those in favor of the amendment, please raise your hand. All right, that's 1. All those opposed? That's 6. Okay. The amendment to the amendment is defeated. Now, we're back to the original amendment.
Mr. Wheeler's motion to amend to add as a second sentence to 7A, quote, the school board chair may also call a special meeting if needed, unquote.
All right, do we need any more discussion in this regard? Mr. Sweeney?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Banks brought up something, and hence the need for a more thorough review and write of this policy. For example, the current policy doesn't even define what a quorum is.
Does the committee determine?
No. I mean, it's Robert's Rules of Order is newly revised, but generally speaking, you define within your policy what a quorum, what constitutes a quorum. Does a majority of the committee or a majority of the members? Those types of things, and so the authority, and I shouldn't say the authority, but their purview to conduct business. But
Okay.
it doesn't define that. So,
But over the last several years, there have been times when the F&T committee said that they could not do any business for lack of a quorum. Do we know what their definition of a quorum is?
the committee does not have its own bylaws. This is the governing document for the committee. So to answer your question, no. So it's always been just kind of a, we'll call it an assumption, but there's nothing that says what the quorum is. So again, it's another flaw in the current policy, and hence the reason it needs to be completely redone. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Thayer.
I guess my thoughts on the F&T committee have always been that, first of all, we're board members. We've been elected by our communities to, we have a fiduciary responsibility to our communities. It's our responsibility to use public funds in an appropriate way, and we're charged with spending monies appropriately. So we're the first line of defense. It's our responsibility to use those monies appropriately. So we're charged with that. Every time an item comes to us, any splost expenditure has the item number listed on it. So that's the first thing, and it's a public listing. So we do that, we check it, we look at that, we publish that. So this is all public knowledge. Before anything is ever spent, it's published in our agendas, it's published on our website, we approve it, it's reviewed by financial services, we all do these things. I've always felt that the F&T committee was a review committee of the public that just for transparency did periodically go back over these for the purpose of reporting to the public that even though we have been this transparent, this is just another check to show that this group, who is more knowledgeable maybe than the general public because they've been studying this, that they looked back over it periodically. So whether they looked at every expenditure as we did it, which is our responsibility, or whether they looked at it periodically really made no difference. So that's the way I have historically thought this committee was supposed to work. So that's the only reason I felt and still feel it doesn't really matter when this committee meets, whether it's monthly or quarterly. Again, I take the responsibility of spending SPLOST money, and I know we each do. We make sure, and the superintendent and his staff, we all make sure that we're spending it appropriately, first and foremost, and we publicize that. So that's the reason that I've not had a problem with this. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Scamhorn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I would like to thank Ms. Thayer for her comments just now because she said it very clearly and very succinctly. So we continue to try to conflate and deflect the simple reason to try to make this better. So I would also like to call the question again to vote on the amendment so we could get to the policy.
I appreciate it, Mr. Scamhorn. If I may, Mr. Doyle, let me ask you, if the quorum is not defined, then what is a quorum if it's just an average committee under, if I may, and then I'll get back to you, Ms. Thayer. Okay. All right.
The quorum is a majority of the
As a
membership.
majority. So if we have 15 members on the committee, then a quorum would be 8. So that really is not that's not an issue here. All right, Ms. Thayer.
We have very few policies in our policy manual that don't need to be revised and don't need to be looked at carefully, and there are changes that can be made. This one's one of them. We can simply refer it to the superintendent's staff to be looked at and make revisions that are needed and to be cleaned up, as we frequently do in others. So I see that as a separate issue to the meeting schedule. So that was all I was going to say.
Thank you, Ms. Thayer. Okay, I think we're ready for a call for the call. Actually, there has been a call for a question, and we've gone over. So this is now the amendment. Do we remember what the amendment is to the motion? Mr. Doyle, would you refresh us real quick so we know how we're voting?
This is Mr. Wheeler's motion to amend to add as a second sentence to 7A, quote, "The school board chair may also call a special meeting if needed," end quote.
Okay. All right. Okay, does everybody understand the motion? Okay, all those in favor of this? Yeah.
I'm sorry. Can you repeat that, please?
Okay, Mr. Doyle, please.
This is Mr. Wheeler's motion to amend to add as a second sentence to 7A, which is paragraph 7A, quote, "The school board chair may also call a special meeting if needed," end quote.
Okay.
Okay, all those in favor of the motion as stated, raise your hand. Okay, all those opposed, raise your hand. All right, that motion is unanimously defeated. Okay. Now, the original motion is that the F&T committee meet 4 times a year, and I believe,
Mr. Chair, may I?
Yes,
This
Mr.
is my
Scamhorn,
motion.
please.
My motion is simply to adopt the policy as stated and has been worked through the work session and now sitting before us. So that's my motion. So, thank you.
Sorry. Okay, now we're ready to vote. All those in favor of Mr. Scammahorn's motion as stated in this policy, raise your hand. All right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All those opposed? 2. The motion passes 5-2. All right, now let me just get centered here. All right, Mr. Ragsdale, we are now ready for your report.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chair, members of the board. I can't even talk now, sorry. Before I ask Mr. Johnson to come forward with the presentation on what you have before you on the agenda, also known as a TAN, I want to take this opportunity to present our chair with the plaque that says, David Chastain, in appreciation for your dedication and service as board chair for 2017 to the Cobb County School District. So I want to say I appreciate everything you have done as chair this year. I know it's an extra above and beyond as far as being a board member to take on that responsibility, and I appreciate that and have enjoyed working with you as chair, and I greatly appreciate everything you've done for the board and specifically for the district.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Superintendent. I've enjoyed it, and I think we are we work well as a group with our diverse opinions, but we all work for the good of our students, and thank you for making it such a good year. All right. Oh, let's. A chair is just a piece of furniture.
All right. So I'm going to ask Mr. Johnson again to come forward and do a brief presentation today. You know, we've talked about this before. And we will be asking the board to move forward in January. And depending on the board's vote on the board meeting calendar for next year, that will determine kind of how we proceed as far as when we get the loan approved, and assuming the board goes down this path. So just real briefly, in the past, when I first came to the district, so it's been a number of years back, this was standard operating procedure to ask the board to approve a TAN at the beginning of each year, and I'm probably taking some of Brad's fire, but as you know, a TAN is a tax anticipation note, and when you take out that loan, you've got to pay it back in that calendar year. So obviously, if you're taking it out to do projects and those kind of things, it makes sense to do it as early in the calendar year as possible, so you get the utilization of those funds throughout the entire calendar year. And of course, then they will be paid back with SPLOST proceeds, because that's the anticipation of the tax note. So all of that to say, when I first came to the district, obviously that was pre the economy tank. We were able to get a TAN and be able to actually make money for the SPLOST accounts in that perspective, because it didn't cost us anything because of the interest on the money and that kind of thing. When the economy tanked, multiple things happened. Obviously, SPLOST revenue went down, interest rates plummeted. So it was actually going to cost money to do a TAN in those years. And the reason you do a TAN is to get a boost in construction scheduling and implementation. Because as you know, when you do a construction project, large projects, especially a school and those kind of things, you're not going to pay for that all at one time. You're going to have phases of expenditures for those particular projects. So having a TAN benefits the district in that you can get more construction projects going concurrently and earlier and be able to save in construction costs. Because as the economy now is turning around, construction costs are escalating very rapidly and are still continuing to do so. So doing a TAN allows us to save money. So there will be a slight cost to doing a TAN at this point in time. As interest rates go up in the near future, that cost will come down, obviously. But also our AAA rating allows us to get the absolute best rate on a TAN. So the benefit to the district is we can save construction costs by getting a jump on the construction projects. And as you've heard me say, we've already identified some of the first projects coming out of the gate. Harmony Leland has already been identified, but then also Pebblebrook and Campbell and King Springs have also been identified as the agenda item today to get those architects on board, approved, and designing that work now so that we will be ready come January 2019 to have already had those projects put out to bid, accepted, and or RFP rather, and be able to turn dirt as soon as possible in 2019, hopefully in the first quarter. That's our target. So all of that to say, we're getting back in the mode of having a TAN be an SOP or standard operating procedure. So, Brad, I hope I didn't take all your fire, but take it from there.
Mr. Banks would like to make a comment, please, sir.
Mr. Morgan and I were the board members here in 2009 and 2010, so we experienced that downturn in the economy. What happened is that we had funds coming in from the SPLOST 3, but also the economy also affected a lot of construction firms. So we took advantage by accelerating and in some cases maybe enhancing the scope of some of the projects that we were able to get done earlier at a much lower cost. So cost is a big factor in SPLOST because your SPLOST, as everybody knows, is in the future. Back then, we took advantage, and one of the big things that we have now is the concert hall at Laster, which I think we spent over what was projected to be around $19 million. We added $1 more million, and we got an excellent facility for our fine arts departments. So a TAN makes a lot of sense. It allows the board to accelerate a lot of these construction projects that we have. And as most everybody knows, we went out for SPLOST 5 1 year earlier. So we're able to actually, in 2018, start making some significant progress in getting these projects started by the beginning of 2019. So it's a great benefit, and I probably spoke on some things that Mr. Johnson's going to speak on, but the public needs to know that we've done this before, and there is a significant savings in construction costs because the economy is booming and construction is just going to be more expensive in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Johnson.
Good morning, board. Y'all did cover quite a few things, but I'm gonna go through the presentation because I do have some technical things to add to this from a financial perspective. So, Mr. Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, members of the board, and Mr. Superintendent, as a result of the many district building projects and to mitigate rising construction costs in the Metro Atlanta area estimated to be in the 4 to 5% range, it is proposed that the district implement an annual short-term construction notes beginning this fiscal year so that the district will have all of its SPLOST revenue funds at the beginning of each year instead of our present procedure of simply collecting the SPLOST revenue 1 month at a time during the year. So with that said, let me go through some question and answers for you, the board. So what is a short-term construction note? So similar to a tax anticipation note, which is a TAN, used for general fund purposes and property taxes, a short-term construction note is short-term debt for a calendar year that must be paid back in the calendar year it was borrowed. These short-term notes would be repaid by the end of the calendar year using SPLOST revenue proceeds that will be collected each month during the calendar year. Short-term notes are not considered long-term debt. Short-term debt is debt less than 1 year. Long-term debt is debt more than 1 year. So how are the district construction costs currently paid? Construction and other SPLOST projects are currently paid using SPLOST funds that are collected on a monthly basis. It is a pay-as-you-go procedure. Why is the district considering a short-term construction note? Construction costs in Cobb County are estimated to increase 4 to 5% each year. By borrowing and starting projects at the beginning of a calendar year, it is estimated that construction projects could be less expensive, resulting in savings for the school district. So what are the details and the timeline if short-term notes are approved by the board in the current FY 2018 fiscal year? The proposed short-term construction notes for calendar year 2018 are only for 2018. The short-term construction notes can only be used to pay for SPLOST 4 projects per short-term construction note financial and legal guidelines. The borrowing timeline. Step 1 would be a January board work session approval where the PFM group, which is our financial advisor, and myself would present to the board the specific short-term construction note proposal, and there would be a resolution for the board to proceed. Step 2, the PFM group, which is our financial advisor, they would market the notes to the U.S. financial market and accept bids. And so what is a bid? We would be looking for the lowest issuance costs, and we would be looking for the lowest net interest cost. Step 3, at the February board work session, the CFO would present the winning bid for approval by the board. Another question, what is the short-term note financial environment in the United States market? Well, in order to secure the very lowest borrowing cost and the lowest interest cost, the district would engage our credit rating agency, Moody's Investor Service, to get a short-term debt credit rating. This rating is different from the long-term AAA credit rating that we currently hold, in that their evaluation of the district in this case would focus more on current assets. The short-term debt is assessed risk by the credit rating agency in much the same way that the long-term debt risk is assessed. The degree of risk is measured via an assigned credit rating of the district's short-term proposed debt issuance. Moody's Investor Service classifies short-term notes into 4 credit rating grades. The highest is Moody's Investment Grade 1, or MIG 1, which is the highest grade. MIG 2 is high quality, MIG 3 is favorable quality, and MIG 4 is adequate quality. Based on the district's current financial status and the district's financial operation, the district expects to receive a very high short-term credit rating. Mr. Chairman, that is my presentation.
Thank you, sir. Is there any discussion, any questions? All right, so we'll look forward to hearing more about this come January. All right, thank you. Next, we have board agenda items. The first thing is our consent agenda. If there's no objection, the consent agenda is passed. Now for discussion, agenda item number 1.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chair, members of the board, I'm going to ask Mr. John Adams to come and bring our discussion agenda item today.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Superintendent, Mr. Chair, members of the board. I'm pleased to bring you discussion agenda item number 1. As we discussed in significant detail previously, agenda item number 1 is recommendation to approve architect appointments for Campbell High School addition and modifications, Hevelbrook High School addition and modifications, King Springs Elementary School replacement, and Instructional Support Center addition and modifications. You heard references earlier to accelerating SPLOST in an attempt to capture some savings in construction costs. This goes right along with that. Our attempt here is to try to have these projects ready to go as soon as possible in 2019 when SPLOST 5 revenues are coming in. So towards that end, we're recommending that you approve architect appointments for these 4 projects so that we can design them and have them ready to go as soon as possible in 2019. Specifically, we're recommending that you allow us to appoint Collins Cooper Carusi out of Atlanta for the Campbell High School addition and modifications, Cooper Carey, also out of Atlanta, for Pebblebrooks addition modifications, Stevens and Wilkinson out of Atlanta for King Springs Elementary School replacement, and then Croft and Associates for Instructional Support Center addition and modifications. These have all been selected by our SPLOST department to best match the needs of these projects and the strengths and weaknesses and historical performance of these firms. We're recommending you approve these to allow us to execute the contracts. The costs you see listed below individually, 1.4 roughly for Campbell, the exact amount listed, 2.2 million for Pebblebrook, 1.368 for King Springs, and then 646 for the Instructional Support Center. As you're aware, this is 5% of the construction estimate in accordance with FEAB. I will note again, though, that the costs will initially be paid for by the general fund, and it is our intent to repay the general fund as SPLOST 5 money becomes available. And I am available for any questions.
All right, thank you, Mr. Adams. I think I saw Ms. Thayer's hand first, and then Mr. Banks.
Just had a question on, can you give us a little bit more detail on the differences in cost, like particularly between the two high schools?
Sure. The Campbell High School project is smaller and costs less because Campbell High School currently is receiving their gym in the current SPLOST. Campbell's project will be classrooms, theater, and electric. Pebblebrook's will be classrooms, theater, gym, and electric. So the difference is made up primarily by the additional gym at that location.
Right.
Ultimately, they will both have additional gym and theaters. Campbell's is just undergoing theirs right now.
Right, thank you.
Okay, Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To carry on Ms. Thayer's question, how many classrooms are we talking about at Campbell?
And in all cases, we will build these schools to meet what we anticipate the capacity to be. But specifically to Campbell, we anticipate adding approximately 44 instructional units to Campbell, so that'll take them from 135 classrooms to 179, and we think that will meet the anticipated capacity.
Now, in our demographic study, Campbell in the next few years will be approximately 3,800 students. Will these additional classrooms meet that need?
Yes, sir. Campbell's current capacity is 2637, and the most recently updated demographic study for 24-25, which is as far out as it goes, estimates Campbell's enrollment to be 3729. So we anticipate that increase will be able to house that capacity.
Let me jump in here for a second, because one thing that we need to talk about is asking the specific number of classrooms today may in fact not be the total number of classrooms that's included, because we're just now asking the board to approve the appointment of the architect. So the design is not even started yet.
Right.
So asking a specific number of how many classrooms will be included, that's an approximate number that John just gave.
Right.
And until we get into the design aspects of it and look at, what we do is we have to take advantage of looking at what the construction timeline is going to be. Okay, and I'll remind everybody, the example that we always use is Teasley. Okay, right. Teasley said it was going to be a 10 classroom addition. But when we got into the design of it, not the appointment of the architect, but into the design of it, we quickly realized, look, growth enrollment projections indicate we're going to be growing significantly at Teasley. So we changed the scope of that project to 20 classrooms. So that's why I want to jump in here, because we don't need to be talking specific classroom numbers today, because we've not even started the design yet.
Well, and I agree with your approximate, we're estimating, this is an estimate to begin with. I'm just concerned about making the community aware that we've got a huge number of students coming into Campbell in the future. Are we addressing it adequately by the numbers? Because in Campbell, using your numbers, we're talking about $28,274,000 for Campbell. And the same thing holds true for Pebblebrook, where Pebblebrook is $43,517,000.
Again, Mr. Banks, I gotta interrupt you.
These are estimates.
Well, you're basing that on the number that's 5% that the architect will be paid, which is 5% of the total project, which is yet to be determined. This is an approximation.
Correct.
So-
Okay, I'll agree with you
Yeah.
that these
So
are
the
just
budget of
estimates.
the project has not been determined yet.
Yeah, but, you know, the numbers that are presented is what we have to work with right now. So, and then these would change over time, and the
Well-
board may change some of the scope, that.
Right, but we're not asking the board to approve any kind of budget for the project.
Right, I'm just saying, you know, based on your numbers, here's what you're estimating the cost to be in the future. It may change.
An estimate is a more general term than I would use because, I mean, yes, we have to estimate and forecast, but this number always changes. The number that's applied to the architect today that we're asking you to approve changes, and that's why the text is up there. These fees, based on the published fee schedules, will be 5% of the actual construction cost of the project. That's why that's always in that item, because this is an estimation and by no means represents the budget of a project.
We will bring you back individual items with specific approvals for budget once we finish design, and we can have probably a more appropriate detailed
Okay,
conversations.
but I'm just looking at, what the future holds and what kind of money are we talking about potentially in the future when we actually start construction and, back in, let's say, hopefully in the latter part of 2018, you bring to the board the actual construction recommendation to start in 2019.
Yeah, so let me again clarify, because this is with great specificity I'm clarifying this. Under no circumstances whatsoever, ever, do we commence a construction project without the board's approval.
Correct.
So it's not, hopefully we'll bring back to the board the cost of the construction project, okay? The board has to approve the actual RFP/bid of a construction project before one shovel of dirt is turned.
Right, and I agree with that.
Well,
I'm just looking at, what the
Yeah, I
potentials
just want
are.
to make sure that everybody is very, very clear on what the process is.
These are not in concrete.
No, the numbers are not in concrete.
Right.
The process
The
is
process are.
absolutely in concrete, engraved, stoned forevermore.
Yeah, okay. There was another question. Well, one of the things I want, make sure that the public understands that we're trying to meet these demographic increases down in the Pebblebrook and in the Campbell area, that this is going to be a significant change in the next 5 years. So, planning now and getting ready, and in Splash 5, if we accommodate these needs, we will not have to put in a lot of portable classrooms at Campbell or Pebblebrook. So I just want the public to know that we're addressing the future.
Yeah, and one final comment to that too. We do our very best to make sure that we're as accurate as possible on forecasting. That's why we have James Wilson, who'll be coming very shortly after the new year to update the demographic study. That's why we update that annually, because we want to make sure that our numbers are as accurate as possible. However, staying on the Teasley example, Teasley has portable units today because the 20 classroom addition did not provide enough space for the growth that was forecasted to a degree, but with the addition of the Brave Stadium coming to Cobb and the developments that's happened in the Smyrna area, obviously it did not provide enough. So there's no guarantee that we will not build an addition, a modification, or even a new school, because as you remember, we built Smyrna Elementary School, and it had over 100 student capacity for growth, and that school is at capacity. It was at capacity actually the next year. It's over now. So I always want to be very, very careful, because we do walk a fine line with SPLOST and projection, enrollment projections, et cetera, because the last thing we want to do is build a building and it's empty. We can't, that's an inefficient use of taxpayer funds. So we have to walk the very fine line of trying to make sure we build adequately to support future and accommodate future growth, but at the same time, not overbuild and then have tons of empty classrooms where growth was projected, but then something changed, the economy or whatever the conditions of the county are. So it is a fine line, and there is no silver bullet. We will always be on both sides of that line. We'll have empty classrooms in some areas, and then, we'll have portables at schools. I would love to be able to say we will get to the point where we have no portables. But there's no way that we can say that. But the one thing I can say is SPLOST has been a tremendous vehicle in allowing us to greatly diminish the number of portables, because we were over 800 portables in this district at one point in time. And now I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we're under 100 that we're utilizing for classroom space. So that is tremendous in and of itself, because we are the second largest district in the state of Georgia. So there will not be a day where we have zero portables.
Well, we're never going to be perfect, but again, I will say the public needs to understand that this board and the superintendent is looking to the future to meet the needs of our communities, and it's important to know that things do change, but we're able to change accordingly to meet the needs of the community, because we know where from our demographic studies that where the growth in population and student population is occurring, and that this board is aware of it, and we're making efforts to address the future needs of the communities. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. Ms. Thayer.
I was just going to say, Mr. Banks, that the central administrative staff has been very good to come to my community, to the Campbell community, and talk about growth and assure the community that classrooms will be built for all of our overcrowding, because my whole community is overcrowded right now. So King Springs, Campbell, and all of that. So we're trying to address the community and keep them informed, because like I said, we're already overcrowded. So the staff has been, Mr. Adams' staff has been very good to come. Anytime we've called them to come down and talk with the community about our growth issues. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Mr. Superintendent.
Make one clarification. So I've just had a phone a friend, and we're at 114 portables now for classroom utilization. So we have broken the 100 threshold. I know we were under 100 a couple years ago, so that's the latest information as far as portables. 114 is still awesome total for classrooms. So it's still awesome that we're down from 800 to 114, but I feel very confident that throughout SPLOST 5 we'll be able to get under that 100 mark again, and that's an awesome number to shoot for. Granted, we do make an effort in this district to make sure that portable classrooms have all of the features of an under the roof classroom in the building, all the technology, all of the intercom, the communication, all of that. So we do strive to make sure that those classrooms are as close to the classroom features in the building that we can. Now, granted, that's not to say that portable classrooms are great, because we wish we could say that we could get to zero portals. But all of that being said, I think we still, as a district, and it's not anything I'm doing, we have always, as a district, strive to try to make the portable classrooms as equitable as possible to the classrooms inside the building.
Mr. Scamahorn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Ms. Thayer covered what I was going to say, and thank you for your comments that board members look at this county as a whole, and we take care of the needs, and we frequently revisit them. I would also, since portables keep coming up, are all of our portables double wides now, or more square than the single? Because, and I'll just go ahead and preface why. I mean, the singles are so long and narrow that my personal, or actually my professional opinion, they're not conducive to real classroom environment.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I know we have made different goals where portables are concerned. I know at one point in time we had some portables that were leased. I think now that all of our portables are purchased because it just doesn't make sense. But there are some situations where we do need to lease portables because one of the costs that surround portables is the actual moving of portables, the relocating of those portables. When we at one point in time in the past we were trying to surplus some portables, and if I'm not mistaken, I think we sold the portable for like $100, but then they covered the relocation of it because that's so significant of a cost. So that's one thing that we have to be very careful of in our planning. Is number one, what do we do with portables when we don't need them, and try not to get an abundance of supply of portables. So that then does play back into the lease option of portables. Certainly, if we have portables in a situation, like I said, there's no way that we can say we're never going to have portables. It does make a lot of sense to have those purchased and be ours, so that we don't have an ad infinitum cost going on forever. But that being said, I don't know specifically the answer to your question about single wide, double wide, that kind of thing. But I know at one point in time we did look at all options that were available. So we are definitely striving, like I said, to make sure that the portable classrooms are as equitable as classrooms inside the building. So,
Okay, and I appreciate that. Let me just rephrase my statement then. I trust the staff to make sure that the needs are appropriate, but a single wide with 25, 30 students in it is just not conducive to a classroom environment. If it's small group or whatever, fine. But if I could have that reassurance, I'm good to go. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Rangsdale.
Thank you, Mr. Scamhorn. If there's no discussion, I think we need a motion to accept this discussion item, Agenda 1. I have a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Morgan?
I make the motion that we approve discussion agenda item number 1.
Thank you, Mr. Morgan. Do I have a second? Mr. Banks raised his hand first. All right, so you have a motion and a second. At this time, let's vote. All those in favor of this motion, raise your hand. That is unanimous, 7-0. Thank you very much. Now, is there a motion to go into executive session for permitted personnel, land, and legal? Mr. Sweeney moved. Mr. Scamahorn second. All those in favor, raise your hand. All right, that's unanimous, 7-0. So we will reconvene. Yeah, we need some time. We'll get back to you. Okay, we are back from executive session, and if there's no objection, all right, we are reconvened. Now we have items requiring action following executive session. Mr. Ragsdale.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chair, members of the board, I'm going to ask John Adams to bring all items requiring action after executive session.
Thank you, Mr. Superintendent, Mr. Chair, members of the board. It's my pleasure to bring you the Human Resources Personnel Report for today, December 6, 2017. We do have one principal level or higher position recommendation. The administration recommends the approval of identified employment actions of those individuals listed on the Personnel Action Report as discussed in executive session. Specifically, we recommend that Paul Watson be appointed to principal at LaBelle Elementary School to be effective January 1st, 2018. And this concludes the personnel report.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. Do I have Mrs. Thayer moves that we accept the personnel report? Do I have a second? Mr. Sweeney, saw your hand second. All those in favor, raise your hand. All right, there's Mr. Yes, unanimous, 7-0. Thank you very much. And this brings us to board member comments. Let's start with Mr. Scamahorn.
Well, first of all, I wish everybody a Merry Christmas, and I think it's been a very productive year. The other thing is, please remember the families, friends of those that have fallen, both militarily, fire, and police, and just to make sure for the record that we know who these folks are. Since last we've met, Detective Sean Matthew Suter, Baltimore City Police Department, end of watch, November the 16th, 2017. Border Patrol Agent Rogelio Martinez, United States Department of Homeland, end of watch Sunday, November the 19th, 2017. Deputy Sheriff Eric Overall, Oakland County Sheriff's Office, Michigan, end of watch Thursday, November the 23rd, 2017. Trooper Damon Allen, Texas Department of Public Safety, end of watch Thursday, November the 23rd, 2017. And Police Officer Kenneth Copeland, San Marcos Police Department, Texas, end of watch Monday, December the 4th, just a couple of days ago. If there is a good side to this, at least there's only about a half a dozen. In months previous, I've been reading off 10 to 15 police officers. One is way too many, but certainly, if you want to call it progress. But remember their families. They're not going to have a Christmas, not this year, probably not next year. And hopefully time will heal the sorrow. And the other thing I'd like to bring up, Mr. Chair, is just recently a retired teacher, Mary McCormick. She's retired from Cobb County Schools. She was just a fantastic neighbor of ours. She passed away a couple days ago of a brain tumor, and it was unexpected and happened very quickly over a month's time. So please remember her husband and her family in your thoughts and prayers. So, and last but not least, I've thoroughly enjoyed working with the staff and the superintendent. And though we have our differences, we're able to work them out, and wish them happy holidays and Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Scamahorn. Ms. Thayer.
Thank you. We have had a lot of sad news lately, I guess. I think everyone in the metro area knows that we lost a very dear, dedicated crossing guard at Lindley, and our hearts go out to that entire family and the Lindley community. That's a very hard thing for all of us to imagine and to deal with. But I also want to thank the mayor of Smyrna, Mayor Bacon, and the Smyrna City Council for having the Mayor's Awards last night. They do that once a semester for all the Smyrna schools, so we appreciate that. They give awards to students and volunteers in the area. So, excuse me, we thank them very much for that. And other than that, happy holidays to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Thayer. Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to say Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to everyone as we celebrate the birth of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. This is a happy time of the year, and I know a lot of people will be traveling, and we pray that they will return home as they left. Maybe a little heavier, but as they left. A couple of things I want to say. The GSBA had a conference this past weekend, and one of the things that stood out for me is on Saturday morning, a person named John Couch spoke to the conference, and he is head of the education part of Apple Computer. So he has some great insights of what has happened and what is going to happen. One of the statements, in fact, he made three statements I'll comment on. One is, if you were born 15 years ago or later, technology was a tool. Today, it's an environment. Also, he says that the classroom as we know it today in the future will not be the same classroom as for education. So classrooms are going to change significantly. And he also made some comments about testing. He said the problem with testing, and I think we've brought this out before, and the superintendent has expressed this, that's a one-day, one-time shot at the knowledge of the student, but that doesn't tell the story of what that student is capable of and what knowledge he really does have. So with the social media and the technology that's available today, our learning process is changing. It's changing very rapidly. I think the superintendent has been very knowledgeable of that by instituting the CTLS, which is a step in the right direction as far as getting the classroom more relevant. I heard a comment several years ago about if you're teaching something that's irrelevant, why are you doing it? So we need to constantly evaluate what we're teaching, how we're teaching it, and ask the question, is it relevant for the future of that student? So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. Mr. Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Like my colleague, Ms. Thayer said, I want to send my prayers, thoughts, and energy to Ms. Etna and her family, entire Lindley community around that tragedy. I want to thank the superintendent and his staff, especially Dr. Daniel, for getting us information in a timely manner about what happened and things of that nature. And like I said at a previous meeting, same way that bus drivers are unsung heroes, so are crossing guards. You think about when you truly think about the importance of that job, it could be life or death, and they get out there, inclement weather, hot, cold, whatever, they're there protecting our babies getting back and forth to school. Also would like to say happy holidays to everyone, and I look forward to seeing you top of the new year. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Morgan. Mr. Wheeler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Like my colleagues, I'd like to wish everybody a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and hope your holidays are full of fun. I'd also like to thank Mr. Chastain for doing a great job with the chair this year. Thank you, board members, and we'll see you next year.
Y'all haven't noticed how this
Thank you, Mr. Wheeler. Mr. Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Happy Christmas, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Hanukkah. And I just want to thank everybody for their hard work this year, everything they've done. Mr. Chair, great job. And to the public in general, I just ask that you slow down around school buses, slow down around schools. It's amazing to me how many times where I see reduced traffic speeds around schools ignored by drivers. And, and then even if you do slow down, the car behind you is urging you to go quicker. But slow down. It's, challenging or, harming somebody's life permanently or ending their life is not acceptable for somebody's impatience. Slow down. Thank you very much, and looking forward to a successful 2018.
Thank you, Mr. Sweeney. Mr. Superintendent.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chair. Obviously, I'm going to echo what a lot of you have already said. We certainly remember the family of Deacon or Jack Harris and Garrett Harris, the previous graduates from Alatoona, that were killed on the way back to college at Georgia Southern. Certainly remember their family in your thoughts and prayers, and also, obviously, our crossing guard, Edna Ume. It's hard to fathom. Obviously, we've got public safety officers, but still, it's hard to fathom in K-12 that an employee would lose their life performing their job. To your comments, Mr. Sweeney, we need people to be aware of school zones. The signs and the lights are there for a reason. We need to keep our students and staff safe, and parents as well. So we certainly want to remember Edna and Edna's family in our thoughts and prayers. Especially losing a loved one during holidays is very, very tough. On a lighter note, happier note, we do want to show thanks and appreciation to the board because I've gotten numerous emails thanking. I've sent you guys one of them, thanking the board for the bonus that was in this month's check or that will be in this month's check for our employees. Greatly appreciated by all employees, and just want to say definitely thanks to all of our employees for the hard work that you do each and every day. Want to wish everybody a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Hanukkah, and just excited to see another year roll around, calendar year, and the second half of the academic year to see the great success that our teachers and students will bring to our district. So thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Superintendent. I've got a little gifts for you, even one for Mr. Doyle. This is 2018 calendars. The Cobb County Marietta Water Authority does 2 art projects a year, and you may recall back in, I think it was January or February, I gave you coloring books designed by elementary school students from around our county. Last month, over at the art station right near Kennesaw Mountain High School, which if you've never been there, you ought to visit, they hung the artwork from our middle high school students and handed out copies of the 2018 Water Smart Water Art Calendar, which, by the way, if you Google Water Smart Cobb County Marietta Water Authority or whatever, you can find the website. There's a PDF version of this. And unfortunately, with a calendar, you have 12 months, and we had kids from all over our middle high schools submit entries. So most of the entries were on display at the art station, got to visit our young artist. And in doing this, I want to use this as a vehicle for saying thank you, thank you, thank you to all of our visual arts teachers throughout our district, and particularly to the middle school arts teachers. When you think about the fact that some of us can't remember middle school, I know I can, I'm somewhat scarred, but that emotional time when on the one hand we're telling them in our schools, this is the way things have got to be, and we're drawing boxes and saying stay in the lines. And these young people in between being a child and becoming an adult go into art class. And that is the one area where we encourage them to find what it is you want to say and express yourself. You can show your feelings, let yourself go. But I've got to believe that being a middle high art teacher is probably one of the more challenging jobs. And so I want to say thank you for them for what they do. And Mr. Banks, I would like to, you mentioned relevance, and I was having a discussion with somebody one time about, teaching art in the schools, and you brought up the word relevance, but you also mentioned Apple. And I like to remind people that all of your computers and most of our programs have multiple I probably shouldn't do it. It's just one multiple fonts that you can work with. And that is a result of Steve Jobs taking a calligraphy class when he was in college. I think he audited. I don't know if he took it. I can't remember the whole story. But it was because of Steve Jobs' calligraphy class that he decided that Apple products had to have all the various fonts for arts, and that's when everybody else picked it up. So there is relevance in the fine arts, and I want to say thank you for our teachers. Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me add one more thing that Mr. John Couch gave to the GSBA conference, and that is there's three major social medias, Facebook, Instagram, and iTunes, I think. There are over, in the Apple store, there are over 1.5 million apps available, and 1 million of those are free. So the horizon is just vast. That's what's available out there. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not the technology anymore, it's the environment we're in. And
You're correct.
And it is social media. Thank you, Mr.
And the
Chairman.
only last thing I would add is during the month of December, when we see all the various images and we hear music from all the different faiths, whether it's Jewish culture or the Christian culture or whatever, it's when people bring out the art that is passed down through families we see the new, more modern art, very relevant. And so, again, I want to say thank you to our art teachers, and if there's nothing else, we are adjourned for the year.